Let me set the stage. You live in Manhattan, New York in 2001. You wake up, you're having a decent breakfast, and then you are taken aback by what you're seeing. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, another one.
Planes fly into the World Trade Center. It was a jet. It was a very large plane. It was going south, but past the Metropolis was being built, and at the time it was too late.
This event is known as 9/11, a brutal terrorist attack that injured over 6,000 people and caused 3,000 fatalities. At this point, President George W. Bush decided to go public and make a speech about such a horrific attack.
On September the 11th, enemies of freedom committed an act of war against our country. All of this was brought upon us in a single day, and night fell on a different world, a world where freedom itself is under attack. Americans have many questions tonight. Americans are asking, who attacked our country? The evidence we have gathered all points to a collection of loosely affiliated terrorist organizations known as Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is to terror what the mafia is to crime. But its goal is not making money. Its goal is remaking the world and imposing its radical beliefs on people everywhere. The terrorist directive commands them to kill Christians and Jews. There are thousands of these terrorists in more than 60 countries. They are recruited from their own nations and neighborhoods and brought to camps in places like Afghanistan, where they are trained in the tactics of terror.
Eventually, President Bush went on to state, while they are the main supplier of humanitarian aid for Afghanistan, he condemns the Taliban regime. Not long after, President Bush began to send in ground units into Afghanistan and began a war that is still going on to this very day. Sometime into the War of Afghanistan, President Bush figured out multiple sponsors of the Taliban regime. One of these sponsors included Saddam Hussein from Iraq. Saddam Hussein was an Islamic terrorist who needed to be stopped. President Bush was ready to declare war, but he ran into a few bumps in the road before he made such an important decision. These bumps included protests in Seattle and London, Bernie Sanders opposing the act of war by saying it would cause more death and more harm than good, and Jeremy Corbyn opposing this act of war as it will cause future death. And finally, the protests. These protests were against the Iraq war as it would cause more death of US soldiers. Some protesters were also worried about the fact that this war was just for the oil in Iraq and not to take out Saddam Hussein. What did you think of the Iraq war?
That's tough.
Was it good or bad? Why or why not?
I think it was bad because I don't really think that we needed to go over there. It wasn't really about that. It was about oil, getting the oil. That's the way I feel.
However, despite all of these protests and some political figures opposing the war, President Bush was still able to commence the war with a voice of reason and a warning for the public.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
The invasion of Iraq began on March 20th, 2003. With the US joined by the United Kingdom and several coalition allies, they launched a shock and awe bombing campaign. This caught the Iraqi forces completely off guard. Very quickly, the US forces swept through the country, overwhelming the Iraqi forces, and they began their final plan to capture President Hussein. Operation Red Dawn. capture Saddam Hussein and take him to a military court to be judged for his actions. The operation was a success. President Hussein was captured and executed 3 years later at a military court. As you all can see, had George W. Bush not made this important decision to invade Iraq, we would have a dangerous terrorist still possibly causing mass chaos and destruction to this very day. We can all thank President George W. Bush for taking action when opposed by many in a time of need.